The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time. At 28 years old, he had served as one of the Queen's Guard for nearly 5 years, and today marked another routine changing of the guard ceremony that thousands of tourists would witness. The familiar weight of his bearskin hat settled on his head as he took his position among his fellow guardsmen, their polished boots gleaming against the palace courtyard. James had always taken immense pride in his role. Growing up in a small Yorkshire town, he had dreamed of serving the crown since childhood. His grandfather had been a soldier in World War II, and the stories of duty, honor, and sacrifice had shaped James from an early age. When he finally earned his place among the elite guards, his family had traveled down from Yorkshire to witness his first ceremony. The memory of his grandfather's proud tears still motivated him during the long hours of motionless duty. The rules of being a Queen's Guard were absolute and unwavering. No matter what happened around them, they must remain perfectly still, eyes forward, faces expressionless. They were living symbols of British tradition and military precision. James had witnessed tourists trying every trick imaginable to get a reaction from the guards. People would make funny faces, tell jokes, even try to touch them. Through it all, he and his colleagues remained stone-faced statues, their discipline unbreakable. Today felt different somehow. As James stood at attention outside the palace gates, he noticed the crowd gathering was particularly large. School, children pressed against the iron railings, their excited chatter filling the air. Elderly couples pointed at the guards, sharing memories of previous visits. Camera phones appeared from every direction, capturing the timeless pageantry that drew millions to London each year. Among the sea of faces, James's trained peripheral vision caught sight of an older gentleman making his way slowly through the crowd. The man moved with obvious difficulty, supported by a walking cane in one hand while his other sleeve hung empty, pinned neatly to his jacket. Despite his physical challenges, there was something unmistakable about his bearing. Even in civilian clothes, James recognized the particular way the man held himself. The straight back, the measured steps, the alert eyes scanning the scene. Before him, the veteran, whose name James would later learn was Thomas Hartwell, had served in the Falklands War in 1982. An explosion from an Argentine artillery shell had taken his right arm and damaged his leg, ending his military career at just 23 years old. Now 64, Thomas had spent decades working as a school caretaker, quietly living with his memories of service and sacrifice. He rarely spoke about the war, even to his own family, but something had drawn him to the palace that morning. Thomas had been visiting London with his daughter Sarah and her 2 young children. It was meant to be a simple family outing, a chance for the grandchildren to see the famous guards and maybe catch a glimpse of the palace. But as they approached the ceremony area, something stirred in Thomas's chest, a mix of pride and sadness that he hadn't felt in years. Watching these young soldiers standing so perfectly at attention reminded him of his own days in uniform, before everything changed on a hill in the South Atlantic. Sarah noticed her father had grown quiet as they joined the crowd. She knew that. Look, the distant expression that sometimes crossed his face when military music played on television, or when they passed war memorials during their walks. She had always wanted to understand more about his service, but Thomas had never been one to share those painful memories. Today, however, something was different about the way he watched the guards. The changing of the guard ceremony began with its usual pomp and circumstance. The band played traditional military marches while the new guards marched in perfect formation across the courtyard. Tourists craned their necks for better views, children sat on their parents' shoulders, and the familiar rhythm of military precision filled the air. James focused straight ahead, his mind empty of everything except duty and tradition. But as the ceremony continued, James found his attention drawn back to the older veteran in the crowd. There was something about the man's posture, the way he stood despite his obvious pain, that spoke to James on a level deeper than his training. The veteran wasn't gawking like the tourist or trying to get photos. Instead, he stood with quiet dignity, his left hand resting on his cane, his eyes reflecting what James somehow knew was deep respect for the ceremony unfolding before him. Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest as he watched the young guards, These men reminded him so much of his own unit, disciplined, proud, dedicated to something greater than themselves. He thought about the friends he had lost in the Falklands, good soldiers who never made it home to see ceremonies like this. The empty sleeve pinned to his jacket felt heavier today, not from shame but from the weight of memories and the brotherhood he had once shared with men in uniform. As the ceremony neared its conclusion, something unexpected happened in the crowd. A small commotion arose near where Thomas was standing. A young child had dropped his toy soldier and it had rolled near the veteran's feet. As Thomas bent down awkwardly to retrieve the toy for the crying child, his balance wavered. Sarah rushed to steady her father, her face showing concern for his struggle. James noticed the brief disruption, though his training demanded he keep his eyes forward. In his peripheral vision, he saw the veteran's difficulty, the concerned daughter, and, the way other tourists seemed to barely notice the older man's struggle, something stirred in James's chest, a feeling that went beyond his rigid training and touched the very core of why he had chosen to serve his country in the first place. The ceremony concluded with the traditional commands and the exchange of duties. As the relieved guards began to march away, James felt an internal conflict he had never experienced before. Every fiber of his training told him to maintain protocol, to march away with his unit as he had done hundreds of times before. But something about that veteran, standing there with such quiet dignity despite his visible struggles, called to a deeper part of James's sense of duty and honor. The moment that would change everything happened in the space of a heartbeat. As James began to march away with his unit, following the same precise steps he had performed countless times, his eyes met those of the elderly veteran one final time. In that brief connection, James saw something that shook him to his core, a look of profound respect mixed with unmistakable sadness, as if the older man was remembering comrades who would never witness such ceremonies again. Without conscious thought, James made a decision that went against every rule in the book. As his fellow guards continued their march, he stopped. The crowd around Thomas fell silent as they noticed the young guardsman had broken formation. Parents pointed, children stared wide-eyed, and cameras began focusing on this unprecedented moment. In the strict world of royal protocol, what James was about to do was unthinkable. Slowly, deliberately, James turned to face Thomas directly. The veteran's eyes widened in surprise as he realized what was happening. Sarah grabbed her father's arm, unsure of what they were witnessing. The other tourists began whispering among themselves, sensing they were about to see something extraordinary. Even the other guards, who had continued marching, began to slow their pace as they noticed their colleague was no longer with them. James raised his right hand to the brim of his bearskin hat in a perfect military salute. The gesture was crisp, respectful, and filled with meaning that transcended the formal ceremony that had just concluded. It was a salute from one soldier to another, from a young man who had never seen combat to a veteran who had sacrificed everything for his country. In that moment, all the rules and regulations seemed less important than acknowledging the courage and service of the man standing before him. Thomas felt his knees nearly buckle under the weight of emotion. In his 40-plus years since returning from the Falklands, no one in uniform had ever acknowledged his service in such a direct, personal way. The simple gesture reached deep into wounds that had never fully healed, touching places in his heart that he had kept carefully guarded for decades. His left hand trembled slightly on his cane as tears welled up in his eyes. The crowd around them had gone completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Phones were lowered, conversations stopped, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something far more significant than the formal ceremony they had come to see. This was raw, human connection breaking through the barriers of protocol and tradition. James held his salute for several long seconds, his eyes locked with Thomas's throughout. In those moments, an entire conversation seemed to pass between them, without words. James's salute said everything that needed to be said about respect, recognition, and the bonds that connect all who have served. Thomas's emotional response spoke to years of quiet sacrifice that had gone unacknowledged by most of the world around him. Finally, Thomas managed to lift his left hand in a return salute. It was shakier than James's crisp gesture, affected by age and injury. but it was filled with dignity and gratitude. The two men held their mutual salute for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Around them, several people in the crowd began to applaud, recognizing the significance of what they were witnessing even if they didn't know the full story. Sarah watched her father with tears streaming down her face. In all her years, she had never seen him display his military pride so openly. The man who had quietly carried his service and his wounds for so long was finally being honored by someone who understood the weight of wearing a uniform. She reached for her phone, not to post on social media but to capture a moment she knew her father would want to remember forever. Other members of the crowd began to understand what was happening. Veterans in civilian clothes straightened their shoulders. Active military personnel, visiting as tourists with their families, moved closer with expressions of respect and approval. The children, who had been chattering excitedly just moments before, watched in fascinated silence as their parents tried to explain the significance of the moment in hushed whispers. James finally lowered his hand, but he didn't immediately rejoin his unit. Instead, he took a step closer to Thomas, close enough to speak quietly without the entire crowd hearing. The noise of London traffic seemed to fade away as the two men faced each other, separated by generations and experiences, but united by something deeper than civilian life could fully understand. "Thank you for your service, sir," James said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of genuine respect and admiration. Thomas struggled to find words, his voice thick with emotion when he finally managed to speak. "And thank you for yours, lad. You've done something today that means more than you'll ever know." The brief conversation was interrupted by the approach of a senior officer who had noticed the break in protocol. Captain Richardson had been observing the ceremony from a distance and had seen James's deviation from standard procedure. As he approached, his expression was stern but not entirely unsympathetic. Years of military service had taught him to recognize significant moments even when they occurred outside the bounds of regulation. "Sergeant Mitchell," Captain Richardson said quietly as he reached the small group that had formed around James and Thomas. "You're aware that you've broken protocol." James straightened immediately, his training taking over despite the emotional moment he had just experienced. "Yes, sir, I am fully aware." The crowd around them watched nervously, sensing that the young guard might be in trouble for his gesture. Some of the tourists began to murmur among themselves about the unfairness of punishing someone for showing respect to a veteran. Sarah moved protectively closer to her father, worried that their presence had somehow caused problems for the kind young soldier. Captain Richardson looked from James to Thomas, taking in the veteran's emotional state and the obvious significance of what had just transpired. In his 25 years of military service, he had learned that sometimes the most important military traditions weren't found in regulation manuals, but in the unwritten codes of honor that bound soldiers together across time and circumstance. "I see," the captain said slowly, his tone revealing nothing of his thoughts. "And you felt this deviation was necessary?" "Yes, sir," James replied without hesitation. "I believe it was the right thing to do." Thomas, despite his emotional state, found his voice and stepped forward slightly. "Officer, if I may speak," he began, his years of military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "This young man has shown more honor and respect in the past few minutes than I've experienced in decades. If there's to be any consequences for his actions, I want it known that what he did was appreciated by this old soldier more than words can express." Captain Richardson's stern expression began to soften as he looked at the elderly veteran standing before him. Years of experience had taught him to read people quickly, and everything about Thomas Hartwell spoke of genuine military service and sacrifice. The pinned sleeve, the careful way he balanced on his cane, and most importantly, the unmistakable bearing that never fully leaves a soldier, all told a story that demanded respect. "May I ask about your service, sir?" Captain Richardson inquired, his tone shifting from disciplinary to respectful. Thomas straightened as much as his injuries allowed, unconsciously falling into a more military posture despite his civilian clothes. "Thomas Hartwell, formerly Lance Corporal, 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment. Falklands War, 1982. His voice grew stronger as he recited his service record, the years of quiet civilian life temporarily falling away. The captain's demeanor changed completely. The parachute regiment was legendary, and the Falklands conflict held special significance for anyone in the British military. These weren't just names in a history book, they represented real battles, real sacrifice, and real heroism. Richardson himself had served alongside Falklands veterans early in his career and knew the unique challenges they had faced. "Two para," Richardson said quietly, using the regiment's familiar nickname. "You were at Goose Green?" Thomas nodded slowly, the memory of that particular battle still vivid even after all these years. "Aye, sir. Lost some good mates there. Lost my arm and nearly my leg at Wireless Ridge a few days later." He paused, looking down at his empty sleeve before meeting the captain's eyes again. "Been a long time since anyone in uniform acknowledged that service." Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement. Her father had never spoken so openly about his military experience, not even to his own family. She had known he served in the Falklands and that he had been injured, but the details had always been kept private. Seeing him share these memories, with fellow soldiers even briefly, gave her a new understanding of the man who had raised her. Captain Richardson turned back to James, his expression now completely different from when he had first approached. "Sergeant Mitchell, in light of the circumstances, I believe your actions, while technically against protocol, demonstrated the highest values of military service. Sometimes the most important protocols aren't written in any manual." The crowd around them, which had been holding its collective breath waiting to see if the young guard would be punished, began to relax. Several people started applauding again, this time more enthusiastically. The children who had been watching wide-eyed began to understand that something good was happening, even if they didn't fully grasp all the details. James felt an enormous wave of relief wash over him, but more than that, he felt validated in his decision. The moment of connection he had shared with Thomas had been worth the risk, and now it seemed that his superior officers understood the importance of what had happened. Military service, he realized, wasn't just about following orders blindly, but about understanding the deeper purposes those orders were meant to serve. "Thank you, sir," James said to his captain. Then, turning back to Thomas, he added, "It was an honor to serve alongside you today, even for just a moment." Thomas's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude and closure rather than pain. "The honor was mine, lad. You've given an old soldier something precious today." As word of the incident began to spread through the crowd, something remarkable happened. Other veterans who had been quietly observing the ceremony began to come forward. A man in his 70s approached, walking with a slight limp, and identified himself as a Korea War veteran. A middle-aged woman stepped up, explaining she had served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. One by one, people who had served their country in various conflicts and peacekeeping missions emerged from the crowd of tourists. Sarah watched in amazement as her father found himself surrounded by an impromptu gathering of veterans from different eras and different conflicts. For the first time in her memory, she saw her father talking openly about his service, sharing stories and experiences with people who truly understood what he had been through. The walls he had built around those memories seemed to crumble in the face of this unexpected brotherhood. Captain Richardson observed this development with interest. Military ceremonies were designed to honor service and sacrifice, but he had rarely seen such a spontaneous and genuine outpouring of mutual respect. The formal pageantry of the changing of the guard had given way to something far more meaningful, a real connection between people who had served their country in different times and places. James, meanwhile, found himself in conversations with several of the veterans who approached. They wanted to thank him for breaking protocol to honor one of their own, and they shared stories of their own service and the challenges they had faced returning to civilian life. For a young soldier who had never seen combat, these conversations provided invaluable insights into the long-term meaning of military service. One elderly gentleman, who introduced himself as a World War II veteran, shook James's hand firmly despite his advanced age. "Son," he said, "what you did today reminded me why I was proud to wear the uniform. It's not about the parades or the ceremonies, It's about looking after each other and honoring the sacrifice. You understood that instinctively. The impromptu gathering continued for nearly an hour, with tourists respectfully giving space to the veterans who had come together. Children sat quietly on benches while their parents explained what was happening. Several people took photographs, but respectfully and with permission, understanding they were documenting something historically significant rather than just another tourist attraction. Sarah found herself talking with some of the other family members who had accompanied the veterans. She learned that many of them had struggled to understand their parents' or spouses' military experiences, just as she had with her father. Watching these old soldiers connect with each other provided insights that years of family conversations had never achieved. As the gathering finally began to disperse, Thomas approached James one final time. The young guard was preparing to return to his duties, but he made time for a private word with the veteran who had unknowingly changed his understanding of service. "I want you to know," Thomas said quietly, "that what happened here today has given me something I thought I'd lost forever. For too many years I felt like my service didn't matter to anyone except the mates who didn't come home. Your salute told me that's not true." James grasped the older man's hand firmly. "Sir, your service has always mattered. Sometimes it just takes the right moment for people to show they understand that. I'm grateful I could be part of that moment." As they prepared to part ways, Sarah approached James with a small piece of paper. "This is my father's address," she said quietly. "I don't know if it's appropriate, but if you'd ever like to visit, I know he'd be honored to share more stories with you. You've given him something today that I've been trying to give him for years, pride in what he did for his country." The days following the incident at Buckingham Palace brought changes that neither James nor Thomas could have anticipated. Word of the Royal Guard's spontaneous salute had spread far beyond the tourists who witnessed it firsthand. Several people in the crowd had recorded the moment on their phones, and by evening videos of James saluting Thomas were circulating on social media platforms around the world. Sarah had initially posted a brief video of the encounter on her Facebook page, simply writing, "A young soldier honored my dad today. I've never seen him so moved." She had intended it only for family and friends, but the emotional power of the footage caught the attention of people far beyond her social circle. Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times, with people adding their own comments about military service, respect for veterans, and the importance of recognizing sacrifice. James first learned about the viral nature of the incident when his commanding officers called him in for a meeting 2 days later. He had been expecting a routine debriefing about the protocol breach, but instead found himself facing questions about interviews with news outlets and requests from television programs. The young sergeant who had simply wanted to show respect to a fellow soldier suddenly found himself at the center of international attention. "The Ministry of Defense has been fielding calls all morning," Captain Richardson explained as James sat in the office, still somewhat bewildered by the turn of events. "BBC, ITV, CNN, and several others want to interview you. There are also requests from veteran organizations and military charities who want to use your story to highlight issues facing former service members." James felt overwhelmed by the scope of the attention. His simple gesture of respect had somehow become a symbol for larger conversations about how society treats its veterans and the bonds that connect military personnel across generations. While he was proud of what he had done, the idea of becoming a public spokesperson for these issues hadn't occurred to him. Meanwhile, Thomas was experiencing his own adjustment to unexpected fame. His quiet life as a retired school caretaker had been suddenly disrupted by phone calls from journalists, requests for interviews, and messages from veterans organizations across the country. Sarah found herself acting as an informal spokesperson for her father, who was still processing the emotional impact of the encounter itself, let alone its aftermath. The most significant development came when representatives from Help for Heroes, a prominent British military charity, reached out to both men. They wanted to feature their story in an upcoming campaign about the importance of recognizing and supporting veterans from all conflicts. More importantly, they were interested in bringing James and Thomas together again for a longer conversation about their experiences and what their brief encounter had meant to both of them. Thomas agreed to the meeting partly because he wanted to see James again, but also because he had been thinking deeply about the isolation he had felt for so many years. The response to the video had shown him that there were thousands of people who understood and appreciated military service, even if they rarely had opportunities to express that appreciation directly to veterans. The reunion was arranged at a quiet location away from media attention, a community center in Thomas's hometown that regularly hosted veteran support groups. When James arrived in civilian clothes, both men initially felt slightly awkward, unsure how to recreate the powerful connection they had shared in the formal setting of the palace ceremony. "Bit different without the bearskin hat and red tunic," James said with a smile, breaking the ice as they shook hands in the modest community room. Thomas laughed, the first genuine laugh his daughter had heard from him in weeks. "I was thinking the same thing. You look like any other young man now, not like some figure from a fairy tale." As they sat down with cups of tea, the conversation began slowly but gradually deepened into territories that both men rarely explored with others. James spoke about his motivations for military service, his pride in the traditions he upheld, and his growing understanding of the sacrifices made by previous generations of soldiers. Thomas, encouraged by the young man's genuine interest, began sharing details about his Falklands experience that he had never discussed with anyone, including his own family. "The thing about coming home from war," Thomas explained, his voice growing quieter as he touched on painful subjects, "is that everyone expects you to just go back to normal life. They don't understand that part of you is still back there with the mates who didn't make it home. Your salute the other day. It was the first time in 40 years that someone acknowledged that part of me still exists." James listened intently, beginning to understand the long-term impact of military service in ways his training had never covered. The young soldier who had focused on precision drills and ceremonial duties was learning about the emotional costs of warfare and the challenges veterans faced in civilian society. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several other local veterans who had heard about the meeting through the community network. Word had spread that the guard from the palace was visiting, and men and women from various conflicts wanted to meet him and share their own stories. What had been planned as a private reunion became an impromptu gathering of military experiences spanning several decades. James found himself talking with veterans from the Korean War, the troubles in Northern Ireland, the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Each person had different stories, but common threads emerged. The challenges of readjusting to civilian life, the difficulty of explaining military experiences to people who hadn't served, and the importance of connections with others who understood the unique aspects of military service. One Afghanistan veteran, a woman named Lisa who had served as a medic, spoke about the isolation she had felt after leaving the army. "Civilians see the uniform and think they understand what service means, but they usually don't. They either put you on a pedestal or treat you like you're damaged goods. Very few people just see you as a normal person who happened to serve their country." As the afternoon progressed, James began to see his role in the military differently. He had always focused on the ceremonial aspects of being a Queen's Guard, the precision, the tradition, the pageantry that tourists came to see. But these conversations were showing him that military service was fundamentally about people, about the connections between those who had chosen to serve, and the ongoing responsibility to support each other long after the uniforms were hung. Thomas, meanwhile, was experiencing something he hadn't felt since his early days in the army, a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. The isolation that had defined his post-military life was beginning to lift as he connected with people who understood his experiences without needing extensive explanations. The gathering continued into the early evening, with people sharing stories, contact information, and plans for future meetings. Several participants mentioned that they had never found a group where they felt comfortable discussing their military experiences, but the informal nature of this meeting had created exactly that environment. As the event wound down, representatives from Help for Heroes approached both James and Thomas about participating in a broader initiative to connect serving military personnel with veterans from previous conflicts. The organization had been looking for ways to bridge the gap between current service members and those who had served in earlier decades, and the natural connection between James and Thomas seemed to offer a model for similar relationships. 6 months after their first encounter, James and Thomas had developed an unlikely but meaningful friendship that extended far beyond their initial moment of connection at Buckingham Palace. Their relationship had become the foundation for something much larger, a mentorship program that paired active military personnel with veterans from previous conflicts, creating bridges across generations of service members. The program, officially called Bridges of Honor, had started small with just a dozen participants in the London area. James would visit Thomas regularly, sometimes in uniform after ceremonial duties, sometimes in civilian clothes during his off-duty time. Their conversations ranged from military history and traditions to personal challenges and family life. Thomas found himself sharing stories he had never told anyone, while James gained insights into the long-term aspects of military service that weren't covered in any training manual. Sarah watched her father's transformation with amazement and gratitude. The man who had spent decades quietly carrying his wartime experiences was now actively engaging with his military past in healthy ways. He had begun attending regular veteran support meetings, had reached out to old Army friends he hadn't spoken to in years, and most importantly, had started sharing his stories with his grandchildren, helping them understand the history their grandfather had lived through. "It's like watching him come back to life," Sarah told James during one of his visits. "For 40 years he carried those memories alone. Now he's found people who understand, and it's made all the difference." The success of James and Thomas's mentoring relationship had attracted attention from military leadership and veteran organizations across the country. The simple gesture of respect that had started everything had evolved into a structured program with formal training, regular meetings, and measurable outcomes for both serving personnel and veterans. Colonel Margaret Hayes, who oversaw the program, from the Ministry of Defense side, had initially been skeptical about formalizing what seemed like a spontaneous human connection. However, the results were undeniable. Participating veterans reported decreased feelings of isolation, improved mental health outcomes, and renewed pride in their service. Active military personnel gained valuable perspective on the long-term meaning of their service and developed stronger connections to military traditions and values. What Sergeant Mitchell and Mr. Hartwell stumbled onto was something we'd been trying to create through formal programs for years, Colonel Hayes explained during a program review meeting. The connection between generations of service members is crucial for maintaining military culture and supporting veteran transitions, but it has to be genuine. You can't manufacture the kind of respect and understanding these two men found with each other. James had been promoted to staff sergeant partly in recognition of his role in developing the program, though he remained with the Queen's Guard for ceremonial duties. His perspective on his military service had evolved considerably. From his early days as a young guardsman focused solely on precision and protocol, he now understood that the ceremonies he performed were meaningful, not just as tourist attractions or displays of tradition, but as connections to the ongoing story of military service and sacrifice. During one particularly moving program event, James found himself speaking to a group of newly enlisted soldiers about the importance of understanding military history through personal connections rather than just textbooks. He shared how his friendship with Thomas had taught him that every veteran had stories worth hearing and experiences that could inform current military practice. "When I first met Thomas, I saw a disabled man in civilian clothes," James told the young soldiers. "But he was carrying 40 years of service experience, combat knowledge, and hard-won wisdom about what it means to serve your country. Every veteran you meet has similar treasures to share, but only if we take the time to show them the respect they've earned." Thomas, meanwhile, had become an unofficial historian for the program, sharing his Falklands experiences with current soldiers preparing for deployment. His accounts of combat, leadership under pressure, and the challenges of military operations provided practical insights that supplemented formal training. More importantly, his willingness to discuss the emotional and psychological aspects of warfare helped prepare young soldiers for realities they might face. The program had expanded beyond London, with similar mentor-veteran partnerships forming in military communities across the United Kingdom. Each pairing was unique, but they all shared the common thread of mutual respect and genuine interest in connecting across generational lines. Some relationships focused on specific technical skills or military specialties, while others, like James and Thomas's friendship, centered on broader questions of service, duty, and the meaning of military life. One of the most successful aspects of the program was its flexibility. Unlike formal counseling or structured support groups, the mentor relationships were allowed to develop naturally based on the personalities and interests of the participants. Some pairs met weekly for coffee and conversation, others communicated, primarily through email or phone calls, and a few had developed family-like relationships that included spouses and children. The media attention that had initially surrounded James and Thomas's story had evolved into broader coverage of veteran issues and the importance of intergenerational military connections. Both men had participated in several television interviews and newspaper articles, always emphasizing that their experience wasn't unique. Similar connections were possible anywhere veterans and active military personnel made the effort to reach out to each other. During one particularly significant interview with the BBC, Thomas was asked about the long-term impact of that first salute at Buckingham Palace. His answer surprised even James, who had heard many versions of the story by that point. "That young man's salute didn't just acknowledge my service," Thomas said thoughtfully. "It reminded me that my service still mattered, that the things my mates and I went through in the Falklands weren't just history. When James saluted me, he was saying that the values we fought for are still alive in today's military. That connection, across 40 years of time, made me feel like I was still part of something important." James found himself nodding as he listened to Thomas's words. Their friendship had taught him that military service wasn't just about the time spent in uniform, but about being part of a continuous tradition of service that connected past, present, and future. The ceremonial duties he performed at Buckingham Palace were meaningful, not just as displays of current military capability, but as visible links to generations of soldiers who had served before him. The program had also begun incorporating family, members recognizing that military service affects entire families, not just the individuals who wear the uniform. Sarah had become an advocate for military families, speaking about the challenges of understanding and supporting veterans. She often shared how watching her father's friendship with James had helped her finally comprehend aspects of his military experience that had puzzled her for decades. As the first anniversary of their meeting approached, James and Thomas planned to attend the changing of the guard ceremony together, this time as friends rather than strangers. The event would mark not just their personal connection, but the success of a program that had grown from a single moment of respect into a nationwide network of military mentorships. The first anniversary of their meeting arrived on a crisp London morning that felt remarkably similar to the day when everything had changed. James stood once again in his red tunic and bearskin hat, but this time he was acutely aware of Thomas's presence in the crowd. The elderly veteran had returned to Buckingham Palace accompanied not only by Sarah and the grandchildren, but by a dozen other veterans who had become part of their extended military family through the Bridges of Honor program. The ceremony proceeded with its usual precision, but for James, every moment carried deeper meaning than it had a year earlier. As he stood at attention, he thought about the conversations he'd had with Thomas and other veterans, the stories they'd shared, and the wisdom they'd passed on to him. The tourist spectacle around him no longer felt separate from real military service. It had become a bridge connecting the public with the ongoing story of British military tradition. Captain Richardson, who had been promoted to major since the original incident, observed the ceremony with particular interest. He had become one of the strongest supporters of the mentorship program and had implemented similar initiatives across other ceremonial units. The young sergeant who had broken protocol a year earlier had become a model for how military traditions could evolve while maintaining their essential character. As the changing of the guard concluded, James followed the same routine he had performed hundreds of times. But as his unit began to march away, he caught Thomas's eye in the crowd. This time, instead of breaking formation, James gave an almost imperceptible nod, a subtle acknowledgement that maintained military discipline while honoring their friendship. Thomas smiled and returned the gesture, understanding that some connections transcend formal protocols. After the ceremony, The extended group gathered at a nearby cafe that had become their regular meeting spot. Veterans from multiple conflicts sat alongside active military personnel, sharing stories and continuing conversations that had been developing for months. The children who had witnessed the original salute were now able to put names and faces to the historical events their grandfather and his friends described. Sarah watched the gathering with deep satisfaction. Her father's transformation over the past year had been remarkable. The quiet, somewhat withdrawn man who had carried his war experiences in isolation had become an active participant in military community life. He spoke at schools about military history, mentored young veterans transitioning to civilian life, and had even written a detailed account of his Falklands experiences for a military history archive. "You know," Thomas said to James as they sat together during the gathering, "I've been thinking about that day a year ago. I came to London just to show the grandchildren the palace. I never expected to find something I'd been missing for 40 years. James nodded, understanding exactly what Thomas meant. "I was just trying to do my duty that day, following the protocols I'd been taught. I never realized that sometimes the most important duty is knowing when to go beyond the protocols." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a television crew that was documenting the anniversary of their meeting for a special program about military service and community connections. Both men had become comfortable with media attention, understanding that their story could help other veterans and military personnel find similar connections. During the filming, the interviewer asked James about how his perspective on military service had changed over the past year. His answer reflected the depth of growth that had occurred through his friendship with Thomas and involvement in the mentorship program. "A year ago, I thought military service was about precision, tradition, and following orders," James said thoughtfully. "Those things are still important, but I've learned that the heart of military service is about people, the people you serve with, the people you protect, and the people who served before you. Understanding that connection makes everything else more meaningful." Thomas, when asked about his own transformation, spoke about the healing that had occurred through sharing his experiences with people who understood their significance. "For decades, I thought my war stories were just painful memories that I should keep to myself. But sharing them with James and other military people has helped me understand that those experiences have value beyond their personal cost. They're part of the larger story of military service, and they need to be preserved and shared." As the day progressed, several significant announcements were made about the expansion of the Bridges of Honor program. The Ministry of Defense had approved funding for a nationwide rollout, with coordination centers in major military communities across the United Kingdom. Additionally, international military organizations had expressed interest in implementing similar programs, recognizing the value of connecting serving personnel with veterans from previous conflicts. The most moving moment of the anniversary celebration came when Thomas presented James with a small, carefully wrapped package. Inside was Thomas's original military identification tags from his Falklands service, along with a handwritten letter expressing his gratitude for the friendship that had developed between them. "These tags went through the war with me," Thomas explained as James examined the worn metal discs. "They're not much to look at, but they represent everything I was as a young soldier. I want you to have them as a reminder that military service connects us across time and experience. Someday, when you're older and meet a young soldier who needs to understand what service means, you'll be able to share not just your own experiences, but the wisdom that's been passed down through generations." James was visibly moved by the gift, understanding its significance beyond its material value. The tags represented not just Thomas's individual service, but the continuous chain of military tradition that connected past, present, and future service members. As the celebration concluded, several participants reflected on how a single moment of human connection had grown into something much larger. The spontaneous salute that had lasted only seconds had become the foundation for a program that was improving lives and strengthening military communities across the country. Major Richardson, observing the gathering, noted how the formal structure of military life had provided the framework for these relationships to develop, but it was the human elements, respect, understanding, and genuine care, that had made them successful. The balance between military discipline and human connection had created something more powerful than either element could achieve alone. Sarah, documenting the day for family memories, realized that she was witnessing something that would be remembered long after the specific individuals involved had passed on. The principles that had brought her father and James together, mutual respect, recognition of service, and willingness to bridge generational gaps, would continue to create similar connections for decades to come. As the group finally dispersed, Thomas and James walked together toward the palace gates one final time. Both men understood that their friendship had become part of something larger than their individual stories. They had demonstrated that military service creates bonds that transcend time, rank, and circumstance, and that honoring those bonds strengthens not just military communities, but society as a whole. The young guard who had broken protocol to honor a veteran had learned that sometimes the most important military traditions aren't found in regulation manuals, but in the human connections that give those regulations their ultimate meaning. The elderly veteran who had quietly carried his service experiences for 4 decades had discovered that his sacrifices were still valued and that his wisdom could continue to serve his country in new ways. Their story had become a testament to the enduring power of respect, recognition, and human connection in military life, proving that a single gesture of honor could create ripples that touch countless lives across generations of service.